Hello, everyone. We're just getting everyone in, knowing some people coming in a little later and everything. So, okay. Well, since people try and avoid our business meeting, I don't know, Vic.
I didn't tell them ahead of time.
Okay.
I feel like I popped somebody out. Probably not.
No, I think you're fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Vic, you want to do your little shindig thing?
Sure. For the small beginning crowd.
They're still coming in. They're trickling in.
All right. I'm Vic Mastone. I'm the chair of the Gene Winter Northeast chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. I'm also the president of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. If you're not a member of either our chapter or the society, please consider joining. The chapters are very modest, $6 a year, and those renewal notices are going out shortly, so we pay on a yearly basis. That's how we organize these lecture series. Also, many of you don't know, but we usually have our elections at the April meeting, and we're going to try to do it again this year, but probably by email as we did last year due to COVID, because we're not going to be able to meet at the Peabody probably until September if we're lucky. And Lindsay's shaking her head. It's like, if we're lucky is what I'm thinking. But anyway, the chapter has 5 offices: the chair, vice chair, secretary / clerk, treasurer, and program chair. If any of our members if anyone's interested in becoming one of those, we certainly are open to nominations. All of the current officers would love to be replaced. We also are willing to serve again, but we're always looking for new blood to get involved. So the members will be getting an email probably in the next week with a deadline of April 6th to get nominations in. And then elections will be starting the 9th through the 16th for voting. And that's what I have to say about that. And hopefully we're hoping to open the Society's Robbins Museum this April, but it's not 100% clear yet if we are ready to do so. With that, Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, we're really excited today. We have Victoria Cacchione is joining us. Where do you live?
I live in Georgia.
Georgia. Okay. I was like, I know it's down south. So this is the amazing thing about, Zoom, that we can do this. So she is a graduate of UMass Boston, which, Vic and I desperately love being graduates from there. She went through the master's program in historical archaeology, and she currently works as the cultural resource specialist at the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. And her research focuses on the African diaspora, Native American archaeology, and the 18th and 19th century America. So we are very excited to have her zooming all the way in for us and everything. So Victoria, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me this evening. I'm very excited to share my research about the Boston family from Nantucket. So I will start sharing my screen and get the PowerPoint started. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, excellent. All right, then I'm just gonna go ahead and get started if that's okay, Lindsay. Excellent. All right. The Boston family of Nantucket is full of revolutionaries, some more subtle than others, but revolutionary nonetheless. In 1770, more than a decade before the Commonwealth of Massachusetts ceased the practice of slavery, Seneca Boston, a slave on the island of Nantucket, married thankful Micah, a local Wampanoag woman. Seneca gained his freedom in 1774 and purchased property on the outskirts of downtown Nantucket, situated between the English settlement of Nantucket and the native ancestral village of Micah. Here he built his family's home. The house, known today as the Boston-Higginbotham House, sits at the crossroads of 5 points leading into town. The Boston family would become one of the prominent families to occupy the neighborhood known as Newtown or New Guinea. One of their 6 children, Absalom Boston, was a highly successful ship captain. In 1822, he captained Nantucket's first all-Black crew on a whaling expedition. However, to the broader Anglo-American community surrounding them, the Boston family consisted strictly of people of color, which on the surface serves to separate Thankful from her Native American identity. The discovery of new archaeological evidence from the home of this remarkable couple sheds light on how Thankful preserved her Native American identity within her family and the New Guinea community. A comparison of an analysis of the most recent ceramic assemblage excavated at the site of the Boston-Higginbotham House and the historical documentation associated with members of the Boston family reveals the Boston family found ways to subvert Euro-American racial, societal, and gender norms while adopting others to elevate their community and retain their cultural connections. Within the practice of African diaspora archaeology and colonialism, scholars explore multiple themes through diverse research questions that aim to increase the visibility of African descendant populations, both past and present. Of these, power and agency resonate heavily with the Boston family's narrative, as they do for a vast amount of families and individuals of color indicating Native Americans. Anna Agby Davies, in her chapter, Practicing African American Archaeology in the Atlantic World, stresses the need to replace tradition with power as the guiding principle behind archaeological research of African American sites. She argues that this shift in the theoretical framework will aid archaeologists in avoiding fruitless debates regarding acculturation and cultural survival. This alternative approach for interpreting the lives of Africans, African Americans, Native Americans, and their descendants follows what Ruth Sims Hamilton, Maria Franklin, and Charles Orser established as a path toward a more critical and self-reflexive archaeology within the field of African diaspora archaeology. Closely related to the notion of power within the study of African diaspora and colonialism is that of agency. Suzanne Spencer Wood addresses the idea of agency by arguing for recognition of a group or individual's active creation of identity through material culture and a deeper analysis of the material culture. In her work on Jewish communities in Boston, Suzanne Spencer Wood argues that non-dominant individuals or groups proactively shape their lives through the choices they make within the context of their own community and the wider dominant culture. Assuming that conquered populations remained passive in their adoption of the dominant culture disregards the humanity of those oppressed. In this vein, Spencer Wood presents the notion of contextual material feminism. This theoretical framework views material culture as social agents proactively used to shape culture and identity rather than simply reflect or express aspects of a culture. Given the context of the Boston family as a multiracial, multi-ethnic family living in an Anglo-American dominated society, these ideas of power and agency inform the interpretation of the assemblage excavated at the Boston-Higginbotham site. These theories of power and agency also intertwine with the efforts of Native American communities to overcome the 19th century myth of the disappearing Indians. For many within the New England Native American communities, exerting their power and agency in both subtle and overt ways allowed their culture to persist. One strategy various tribes implemented following the Europeans' initial arrival and the subsequent epidemics that depleted the Native American populations was to allow freedmen and escaped African slaves to marry into their communities. This survival tactic proved mutually beneficial for both the Native American and African American communities, as any children born to a Native American mother retained her status as a free person. The Native population maintained their numbers, and the African Americans found a refuge. However, it has also caused a crisis of identity among the Native populations and the African Americans who married into the tribes. In the second half of the 19th century, the Mashpee Indians of Cape Cod faced internal discord when the African American members of their community called for the dissolution of the tribal system. The African American men felt the tribal laws unfairly restricted their rights as citizens, mainly the right to own land. However, in order to preserve their status as a tribe, the laws remained intact. This issue centers around disconnects between how members of the tribes recognized themselves and how the Anglo-American society viewed them. In order to avoid becoming a disappearing people, the Native Americans needed to maintain as much of their traditional customs and laws at the expense of the colored foreigners. In the New Guinea community on Nantucket, the opposite happened. The local Wampanoag women who married into the African American families forfeited their Native identities in the eyes of the Anglo-American society. The archaeological analysis of the Boston-Higginbotham site thus provides a window into these complex historical processes of community and individual identity formation. The cultural persistence of Native American women like Thankful Micah and the community building practices of people of color in New Guinea serve as concrete examples for the use of their agency against instances of the racial and economic inequalities of power they face regularly. As historical archaeology often does, researching Seneca Boston and Thankful Micah in both the historical and the archaeological records reveals two contrasting identities, especially for Thankful. The most enlightening documentary sources for discerning Seneca and Thankful's identities within Nantucket and the wider Anglo-American Society of the United States are the federal and local census records. The absence of any member of the Boston family from the first federal census in 1790 clearly indicated their status as people of color and Native American. The 1800 federal census continues to perpetuate this identity for all members of the Boston household as people of color, as it lists Seneca as the head of a household for 6 people in the unofficially designated section for minorities on the island. It remains unclear if those 6 people include Thankful Micah. In federal census records from 1790 to 1860, Native Americans are not included because they were not required to pay taxes to the United States government. However, the census takers' criteria for what constituted a person of color appear to be broad enough to encompass the native inhabitants of the New Guinea neighborhood. Among the list of heads of households from the minority community on the island, the census taker listed at least one known Native American, Abram Quady or Quarry. This was not an uncommon practice, as Jack Forbes illustrates in his book, Black Africans and Native Americans, Color, Race, and Caste in the Evolution of Red Black Peoples. In his discussion of how Anglo-Americans classified Native Americans as mulattoes, Forbes describes an instance of a prominent Native American family in Virginia that settled outside of the main community, being referred to as free people of color in the 1810 census, then adds mulattoes in the census of 1850. Such a designation seemingly applies to Native Americans on Nantucket living amongst the free Africans in the New Guinea community, especially for Thankful Micah. In 1810, a descendant of a prominent Anglo-American family on Nantucket, Obed Macy, conducted a local census that separates the people of color and Native Americans on the island. Thankful, appearing for the first time by name, is included under people of color as Thankful Boston, widow of Seneca. As a widow, she now serves as the head of her immediate family, still residing at home, including her sons Thomas and Joseph, 27 and 21, respectively. Macy's categorization of Thankful as a person of color rather than Native American reflects the biases within the Anglo-American community in the broader United States, not just Nantucket. Previous local population records from 1792 and 1807 also exclude Thankful Micah from the number of remaining Native American women on Nantucket. Yet by 1792, Thankful was married and settled into her home with Seneca and their children on York Street. As Forbes states, during the 18th century, most persons of mixed race, especially if free, were classified as mulattoes, musties, or persons of color. This practice continued into the 19th century as well, with people in Indian communities in Massachusetts being referred to as Indians, mulattoes, and people of color. While Thankful herself was not of mixed race, her children were, and she was the wife of an African American. However, Thankful's exclusion from the list of remaining Native Americans and the classification of her as a person of color rather than a Native American in 1810 demonstrates a conscious effort to separate her from part of her identity as a Wampanoag woman. While mislabeling individuals of Native American and African American descent on federal census proved to be pervasive throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, it is essential to acknowledge their humanity and persistence. Thankful, Seneca, and their children were not uncommon in their experiences of navigating multiple racial identities in a white-dominated society. Such households were present all over Bristol County in southeastern Massachusetts. One such household in Westport was that of Captain Paul Cuffey Sr., a Native American and African American sea captain. He lived among other musty households, including those of Hannah Cook, Absalom Boston's second wife. Absalom and Hannah's sons and others in the family remembered their Native ancestry. Additionally, Seneca's older brother also married a Wampanoag woman from Cape Cod named Falafir and established a family of his own. The archaeology from the Boston-Higginbotham House sheds light on how thankful Micah ensured that Absalom and his siblings remained connected to their Native American heritage. To discern a better understanding of Thankful and Seneca's lived experiences and how they retain their power and agency in expressing their respective Native and African identities, I turned to the archaeology. I specifically studied the ceramics present in context excavated in the summer of 2014. I focused on 4 main artifact lots that yielded a mean ceramic date between 1797 and 1822 to capture Seneca and Thankful's occupation of the house. Through a minimal number of vessel count, I was able to better comprehend the family's consumption patterns, which provided evidence for the family's household practices and role in the broader community. The assemblage yielded over 300 vessels, totaling 699 sherds. The majority of the vessels were pearlware, followed closely by creamware and redware. The remaining ware types present include whiteware, porcelain, stoneware, Native American, yellowware, indeterminate buff-bodied earthenware, lusterware, and tin glaze. For a late 18th, early 19th century household in New England, this assemblage would be indicative of a middle-class family. It possesses all the correct material and decorative types for the period. However, the Boston family is not a typical New England family, and their ceramic assemblage reflects this. The assemblage includes 3 individual or groups of vessels of interest that increase in significance when considered with the family's racial and ethnic background. The most unassuming yet most revealing ceramic vessels present in the Boston family ceramic assemblage are the stoneware, jars, jugs, and crocks. While only 6% of the total assemblage, these vessels indicate the family's ability to preserve and store excess food. Thus, the 19 stoneware vessels indicate that the Boston family was able to purchase surplus food for themselves and to potentially share with their neighbors. Also indicative of Seneca and Thankful's roles as leaders in the New Guinea community, and more specifically, Seneca's African identity, is a mid-18th century tin glaze punch bowl. Such vessels are traditionally associated with social gatherings, and in the context of the Boston household, highlight more than just their desire to adopt European ideals of gentility. The punch bowl might also be a sign of Seneca's connection to the maritime industry of Nantucket. Seneca appears twice in the account book for the ship Alligator, once in 1804 and again in 1806. While the document does not specify what type of work Seneca conducted on the ship, he is listed in several documents as a weaver and others as a mariner. The merchants connected to the maritime trade used community gatherings, often centered around punch consumption, as one of the ways they both projected and reinforced their social position. The punch bowl at the Boston household likely served a similar function and is indicative that communal dining occurred within the Boston household during Seneca and Thankful's occupation of the house. The most important ceramics discovered in the ceramic assemblage from the 2014 excavations constituted less than 1% of the minimum number of vessels, yet they shed light on the persistence of Thankful's Native American identity. Each of the earthenware vessels appears to be locally made on the island. However, several seem to be wheel thrown and fired at higher temperatures than the others, which suggests that they were produced using European manufacturing techniques. The presence of Native American ceramics on any site in New England that postdates King Philip's War is particularly important to the discussion of the power of Native Americans to continue their cultural practices following the presumed annihilation of their traditions. Prior to the discovery of these few sherds, the presence of Native ceramics in historic context has not been extensively documented archaeologically. In order to determine when and how the vessels were constructed, as well as their connection to earlier Native pottery manufacture techniques and motifs, it was necessary to locate comparable data from other sites in southern New England. Good B displays characteristics of 17th century pottery found on sites associated with the Narragansett and Wampanoag tribes in a follow-up publication from his dissertation analyzing the close political relationships between each tribe through their ceramics traditions. The overwhelming majority of the ceramic vessels possessed fine, well-sorted shell temper with a smooth exterior. The average rim thickness of both cultures' pottery measured about 6 millimeters, while the average body thickness was between 5 and 5.5 millimeters, Wampanoag pottery being on the thicker side. The general trends Goodby identifies in the ceramic vessels from both cultures compared to pre-contact period pottery include a more uniform surface treatment, finer and better sorted temper, thinner vessel walls, and less evidence of breakage along coil junctures. He states that the ceramic assemblages from Wampanoag and Narragansett tribal areas were found to be technologically indistinguishable from one another. Goodby concludes that no one vessel, form, or decorative motif could exclusively be attributed to either tribe. As for sites specific to Nantucket, the Massachusetts Historical Commission contains reports from 6 sites associated with Native Americans. The dates for these sites range from the late Archaic Middle Woodland to the colonial period. Only 3 of the reports mention the recovery of pottery sherds. The reports that include information on the Native American ceramics found on the sites describe thickness measurements, decoration motifs, and temper characteristics. Although small, this sample still provides ample amount of data to determine how the sherds from the Boston-Higginbotham House compare to other locally made Native American pottery in the immediate vicinity of the site. The sherds from the 3 sites possess body thicknesses ranging from 5 millimeters to 10 millimeters, and rim thicknesses ranging from 8 millimeters to 10 millimeters, suggesting either the sherds found could reflect the change over time that Goodby recognizes in his study, or the pottery traditions on the island did not experience the same trajectory as those on the mainland. In comparison to the sherds examined in Goodby and the various archaeological reports from Nantucket, the body thickness measurements from the sherds excavated at the Boston-Higginbotham House coincide with those from Goodby's 17th century Narragansett and Wampanoag sites, but are slightly slimmer than those from either Nantucket sites, earlier Nantucket sites. The Boston-Higginbotham body sherds measure between less than 5 millimeters to 7 millimeters thick. However, the 2 rim sherds recovered measuring 9 millimeters and 10 millimeters thick more closely aligned to the Nantucket sherds than to those discussed in Goodby. However, in terms of temper, the Boston-Higginbotham House sherds all consist of fine or fine to medium grain grit temper. Not a single sherd recovered at the Boston-Higginbotham House contained shell temper inclusions. This serves as a departure from both Goodby's sample and the Nantucket-wide sample. The majority of the sherds included in Goodby's analysis had shell temper ranging in size from fine to medium. The less uniform descriptions of the Nantucket sites prohibit a conclusive comparison in temper size, but on the whole, the temper inclusions were more varied between shell and grit than the sample from the Boston-Higginbotham House. When compared directly to the sample Goodby presents, the presence of 5 burnished sherds on the Boston-Higginbotham site suggests use of a Narragansett decorative technique, as the only burnished sherds in Goodby's sample are found on Narragansett sites. Additionally, none of the sherds described in the Nantucket reports are burnished. Though not all of the sherds possess smooth exteriors, which differs from Goodby's data set of sherds from Wampanoag sites. Given the small sample sizes being compared, surface treatment does not really determine tribal connections, especially because Goodby already established a close connection between the 2 tribes' ceramic traditions. However, this comparison does establish burnishing as a regional Native American pottery manufacturing technique. Similarly, triangular incision patterns in corded decoration that appear on the 2 rim sherds from the Boston-Higginbotham House are also present on sherds from Nantucket sites and are similar to traditional decorative motifs in Fowler's Handbook of Indian Artifacts from Southern New England. Having established the similarities and differences between the 3 samples, the most significant, sorry, my dog is coming. Okay, sorry. Having established the similarities and differences between the 3 samples, the most significant deviation from the pre-contact and 17th century sherds present on the sherds excavated from the Boston-Higginbotham House is the manufacturing technique applied to the majority of the sherds. 8 of the 11 sherds, comprising 4 distinct vessels, possess fine interior impressions consistent with wheel throne manufacture, a European technique. Prior to European colonization of New England, all Native American ceramics were constructed using the coil building technique, so the wheel throne ceramics are different. The incised decoration on one of the rim sherds seems to be made using a specialized precision tool. And the sherd I'm referring to is this one. This is the exterior and this is the interior of that one. And these are the burnished sherds mentioned earlier. Now I've lost my place, sorry. Additionally, that rim sherd constitutes the most unique sherd in the assemblage of locally made Native American ceramics, as it is also constructed using what appears to be mass-produced clay. Without concrete documentary evidence of a Native American potter or archaeological evidence of a Native American pottery kiln site present on Nantucket, it is difficult to discern who manufactured these vessels that the Boston family owned. However, given the wheel throne manufacture, specialized clay, precision tools used for decoration, and the presence of the sherds in contexts associated with a buried ground surface with a mean ceramic date of 1797, it can be surmised that the locally made Native American ceramics present at the Boston-Higginbotham House site are contemporary to the Boston occupation of the property. Therefore, they offer physical evidence of Thankful's Native American identity within the household. They also strongly suggest that there was a continuation of Native American pottery tradition on Nantucket after King Philip's War. Just like the Native Americans themselves, the tradition did not die out with the constant encroachment of European dominance in New England. To the wider public of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Nantucket, the Boston family constituted a typical middle-class family living in New Guinea's neighborhood. They owned a hall and parlor style house with multiple parcels of land. They purchased all the fashionable ceramic vessels suitable for their social economic status. However, in their private lives among their family and neighbors, Seneca Boston and Thankful Micah consciously used these European goods to maintain aspects of their respective cultures. Thankful also strove to sustain her Wampanoag heritage among her own growing family through the use of native goods. For the Boston household, these ceramic vessels simply represent Thankful's connection to her native heritage and her effort to retain her native identity amongst her family and her local New Guinea community. To the outside Anglo-American society, she relinquished her Native American identity once she married Seneca Boston, an African-American. However, she clearly imparted some of her Native American culture onto her children and relatives. In 1822, Essex Boston and Peter Boston, along with Jeffrey Summons, wrote to the Society for Propagating the Gospel among Indians and others in North America, seeking financial aid and access to their educational services on the basis that their community included many Native Americans. The letter states, "There are among the colored people of this place remains of the Nantucket Indians, and that nearly every family in our village are partly descended from the original inhabitants of this and neighboring places." Thus, the legacy of Thankful and her native peoples continued to live on within the New Guinea community. The native ceramics found at the site of the Boston-Higginbotham House provide the tangible evidence for Thankful's efforts to preserve her Wampanoag culture. Not only did Thankful educate her children about her native heritage, she also encouraged them to read and write, as the pencils and ink bottles found in the site's archaeological assemblage suggest. The archaeological and historical records also provide evidence for the Boston family's cultural and moral literacy. Laura Arnold Liebman defines this form of literacy as an accumulation of shared knowledge and character traits that were preached, if not practiced. Pencils, ink bottles, and legal documentation associated with the site offer direct evidence of the family's literacy capabilities and practices. The family's emphasis on both cultural and moral literacy extended beyond Seneca and Thankful to the family's future generations. In particular, the women of the second and third generations of the Boston family exemplify this best. Thankful lived most of her adult life at 27 York Street, the house Seneca built for her and their family. She was able to do so even upon Seneca's death in 1809, due to the care of her daughter-in-law, Mary Boston Douglas, Freeborn's wife. In 1802, Seneca sold the property to his eldest son, Freeborn, for the $324. However, Freeborn predeceased his father in 1809, which reverted the property back to Seneca. Upon Seneca's death later in 1809, the property was divided among his and Thankful's children, including Mary, as Freeborn's recent widow. Seneca's will stipulates that Mary and her children with Freeborn may continue to reside at 27 York Street as long as she cares for Thankful for the remainder of Thankful's natural life. Until her death in 1834, Mary served as the head of the household, even after her marriage to Michael Douglas in 1811 and Thankful's death the following year. An earlier agreement in 1812 equally divided the property among Mary and Freeborn's 3 children, William, Eliza, and Charlotte, to ensure the property remained in the Boston family upon Mary's death. Of the 3 children, Eliza Boston Berry became the primary owner of the home following her husband's departure for San Francisco in search of work as a mariner between 1850 and 1860, and the death of her sister, Charlotte Boston Groves, in 1851. Late in life, Eliza enjoyed the company and care of her widowed niece, Elizabeth Groves Stevens, whom she bequeathed the estate to upon her death in 1883. The 1900 census lists Elizabeth Stevens as the head of the household for the York Street property. She can read and write. The house is also owned free of mortgage. Elizabeth then sold the property to her niece and nephew, Caroline B. Talbot and George Groves Hogarth, in 1915. The passage of the house through the female line guaranteed the house remained in the family for 4 generations, spanning 145 years. The archaeological assemblage further highlights the efforts of Thankful, Mary, and Eliza to raise well-educated children and instill strong community connections within their children. It is likely Thankful, Mary, and Eliza taught or encouraged their children to read and write within the home. Such practices illustrate the convergence of literacy practices and moral literacy, as children were often taught the traditional reading and writing skills while also learning to be culturally and morally literate. Indicative of such practices are blue transfer printed pearlware child's mug, teacups, and dining bowls dating to Mary Boston Douglas's occupation of the home. In her dissertation on the Boston family, Teresa Bolger discusses a blue transfer printed pearlware child's cup found at the site as an example of parents shaping their children's moral and religious education within the home. The poem printed on the cup, entitled Early Piety, reads, "What blessed examples do I find, writ in the word of truth, of children that began to mind religion in their youth. Jesus, who reigns above the sky and keeps the world in awe, was once a child as young as I, and kept his father's law." This child's mug and 4 specific vessels containing the image of a mother bird guarding her nest proved to be consistent with both middle-class Black and white ideas of domesticity and motherhood. However, Bolger stresses Mary's choice in purchasing and displaying these vessels in her home was not one of blind acceptance of notions of white womanhood. Bolger states this was not a matter of emulating white womanhood, but of asserting respectability and belaying the stereotypes that would otherwise exclude Black women. In choosing to purchase teacups and dining bowls with this particular image, Mary Boston Douglas used her consumer power to rebel against racial prejudices and assert her claims to gentility within a white society. More evidence for the family's cultural and moral literacy appears in Seneca's will that stipulates that Mary Boston Douglas and her children may reside in the house as long as she cares for an ailing Thankful. This communicates the importance the Boston family placed on continuity of ownership and the interdependence of family, 2 elements that continued to be significant for the female members of the Boston family, as illustrated in the lives of Eliza Boston Berry, Mary and Freeborn's daughter, and Elizabeth Grove Stevens, Eliza's niece. In 1830, Eliza Boston married Lewis Berry, who became heavily involved in the abolitionist movement on Nantucket. As Teresa Bolger notes, history focuses on the well-documented men associated with such movements. Therefore, it is necessary to acknowledge the role women like Eliza played behind the scenes. In raising her children and helping to raise her nieces and nephews within the confines of 27 York Street, Eliza and others like her worked to maintain familial stability in the face of social turmoil. In Eliza's case, she did so even while working outside the home. According to 1830, 1860, and 1870 census records, Eliza served as a domestic. Bolger indicates that Eliza's choice to work for a white family on Nantucket came from her desire to keep her home at 27 York Street in the family, something that Bolger states was an act of defiance and pride rather than selflessness and submission. Her efforts proved worthwhile as her niece Elizabeth chose to return to Nantucket to continue the tradition of caring for her older relative and the house, as well as engaging with and uplifting the community. Elizabeth Grove Stevens returned from Brooklyn, New York in 1883 for the express purpose of caring for her Aunt Eliza. Upon Eliza's death, Elizabeth was the only remaining Boston family member on the island. She inherited the house at 27 York Street. Due to the efforts of Eliza, Mary, and Thankful to maintain possession of the house, Elizabeth owned the home free and clear and as a free woman. Due in part to chance and the fluctuating social and economic climate of Nantucket, the Boston-Higginbotham House was passed down to the women of the Boston family for 4 generations. However, it was the women's revolutionary spirit, evidenced in Thankful's reluctance to forget her native heritage, even as white society ignored it, Mary's determination to participate in white middle-class ideas of motherhood and respectability, Eliza's employment as a domestic outside the home, and her work behind the scenes to ensure familial stability, and Elizabeth's continuation of familial duty to care for those in need that Mary first displayed in her care of Thankful. It is these choices, some only revealed through archaeology, that prove the power of these women. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to actually unmute everyone so they can ask questions as opposed to using the chat feature, since there's only a few of us here right at the moment. I do have we have a couple of basic questions that Lindsay likes to ask, but since she's taking a class at the same time this is going on, I guess I'll ask it, even though she's logged in because she's recording. The first question we always ask our speakers is, how did you get interested in archaeology?
That is a great question. I've always wanted to be an archaeologist from a really young age. And I think part of it comes from just my general love of history, and this being a good extension of that, an exciting way to, get out of the library and the books and actually have hands-on experience with history. And I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, so we would go to Cahokia Mounds a lot with school and even with my family. So I think just having that experience and just my love for history really played into why I wanted to be an archaeologist.
And sort of a follow-up, how does that work with your current position?
So as the cultural resource specialist for Jimmy Carter National Historical Park, I am in charge of not only the museum collection that's at the park, but also anytime that a shovel goes into the ground at the park, I am on hand to make sure that they don't encounter any archaeological site that hasn't been previously documented. So I care for museum objects and archaeological assemblages that have been previously excavated, but then I also try to find new ones as well.
I'm allowing other people to unmute themselves if they want to ask questions. I have a sort of a mythology question, in the sense, when I was a grad student, when President Carter was elected, the whole story for us was that he was a collector, that he had an arrowhead collection. And so I wanted to know what the story was behind that, or the backstory.
So I don't know the full backstory. I do know that he still has that collection of projectile points that he found either on the farm or around the area that will someday become part of our collection, but right now he is keeping that for himself. So I haven't gotten to see it yet, but I have heard of it.
All right, I'm just so anyone wants to unmute, please do so and ask questions. I'm having a little difficulty on this end. Sorry.
Okay.
I thought I had the, let's see. Well, I allow parties to unmute. Anyone unmuting?
Hi, Victoria.
Hey.
Dale Trubowitz. I used to run Mastodon State Historic Site in Kimmswick, south of St. Louis.
Oh, yeah.
When were you? When did you were living there?
We moved in 2010. So from 93 to 2010.
Well, I was in charge of Mastodon from 93 to 96.
That's amazing. And Kingswood's such a fun town too.
Mhm.
Any other questions? I could ask a couple more. You talked a lot about the Boston sort of being a middle-class family. Have you looked at other collections on the island that are quote middle-class families? And I know you mentioned the redware seemed to be more indicative of the Native American side of the family, but seems to be such a common ware that I would expect that to be also pretty prevalent in middle-class homes.
So Nantucket is interesting in that there isn't a lot of household archaeology that comes from the island specifically. So when I was doing my research, I looked more at areas surrounding the city of Boston. So I looked at households. I looked at a white household and I looked at another Native American household. And I also compared this site to the Boston Meeting House, the Boston African American Meeting House in Beacon Hill. Sorry, I've been out of Boston so long, I don't even remember. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot from the island to compare to just yet. If they do find anything, it's mostly in private, it's privately owned sites. So I had to kind of extend just to be in Boston. Sorry about the dogs.
All right. I'm sort of, my screen doesn't tell me whether people are wanting to speak. Does anyone else have a question for Victoria? It's a very quiet group tonight, but probably partially because they're all hidden behind their veiled names on the screen.
What a wonderful talk. I unmuted myself.
Thank you, Anne Marie.
What a great talk about, and I so appreciate that you used her name, the beautiful name of Thankful.
Yes.
You know, but it was really, we could really feel her presence through the artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yes.
But I was thinking of parallels, Neil, with Cedar Grove. You know, that these displaced populations found family because they were, you know, they were thrown together as displaced populations. So that's what Cedar Grove
Right.
was. And you were the chief archaeologist there, Neil.
Yeah, for those who aren't familiar, Cedar Grove was a late prehistoric, early historic Caddo village on the Red River in Arkansas, which the Corps of Engineers was going to take out for a revet. And so I did the data recovery, and we had the Caddo houses and their adjacent cemeteries. And in the slave days, a slave cemetery had been established on that property. It was outside the levees that protected the crops. And so we had African-American graves of people who certainly had been born slaves, in some cases cutting perpendicular through Native American graves. And we know that those black grave diggers were selling pots back in the 1920s. So that's where they came from. But Jerry Rose, a bioarchaeologist,
Exactly. Yeah.
did the data recovery on the African-American cemetery. I was only allowed to recover the Native American stuff. and it was done as a separate core project, which was one of the groundbreaking physical anthropology projects, because they only had 24 hours to remove and study the bones before they were turned over to the local Black community church. So they had on-site analysis and recording, and it was a huge project. Gone to a Better Land is the starting title of
Right.
Jerry's book, and it's a trendsetter.
It is. Well, it was the intersection that you were talking about in your talk, it's that intersection of Native American and African American. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good stuff. But that Cedar Grove, I was part of the crew that went out, and we were all graduate students under Jerry Rose. And we just had osteology, and then we'd all finished the program and gone. I'd started doing forensics down in Louisiana when I left graduate school. But like graduate school is, it's a bunch of people from all different places, but mostly the North. So we used to go to Neil's house and have Truwawitsa-Ganses. Remember those?
Oh God, yeah. The no basement, concrete floor. You could dance all you wanted, and the record player didn't shake.
And Donna Summer was on the, was the music du jour of the day. So.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not there now, because that house would have been a mess in that snowstorm that they just had down there. Boy.
Yeah.
Well, are there any other questions from any of the audience? I really want to thank you, Victoria. It was actually much different than what I expected, and I'm really, in a really good way. And then having Anne Marie and Neil sort of bringing that other aspect really broadens it for us.
Well, and it's good to see that public archaeology is alive and well.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's really public archaeology, still forensic archaeology is, because it's at that interface. So where are you located?
I'm in Plains, Georgia. So southwest Georgia, I guess. Yeah. But I haven't been here very long, so I still kind of consider myself a Bostonian.
Just be careful saying that down there.
Oh, I know. So
Say you're
they
from New
don't-
Hampshire.
Yeah.
Sorry, say that again.
I said, say you're from New Hampshire.
Yeah.
But, well, I'd like everyone to sort of give a round of applause, even though you really don't hear it.
Well, thank
We're
you very
really
much.
pleased.
Wonderful.
If you send me your contact information or send it to Lindsay, we'll get you that, the membership to the society as our thank you. We
Yeah.
really do appreciate you taking your time this evening to lecture us and on a really interesting topic. We just don't really hear about the historic as much, and Lindsay's been good about bringing in more historic archaeology, but this is sort of a nice transition piece.
Good. Good.
So-
Well, thank you so
Very
much for having me.
interesting.
And I hope your dog will now be happy that,
It gets your
I can
all
go
your
play with him
attention.
now.
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and you have a good evening, and we'll be in touch.
Yes, thank you. You too. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Justin.